All right, welcome back, everybody. Happy Monday to you all. I'll give it a few minutes here and make sure you all can hear us. I'll put something here in chat. Welcome, everyone. Let's see. Can you all just give me a yay, nay? Can you audio coming through, chat coming through, all those good things? If you guys could just let us know, be much appreciated, and we'll get kicked off here in just a moment or two as folks trickle on in. Hey, Ed, good morning. Can you hear us okay?
Yep. Ed.
Hey,
Yep.
Andrew,
Everybody
Joel,
good?
see you all.
All
All
right,
right,
good.
now they're all coming through. All right, fantastic. I hope you all had an awesome weekend. And all right. All right. So I'll set the stage here, by the way. Let's see. Gosh. All right. So just quick announcement. I'm going to put in a URL for tomorrow. We have a webinar with Eric Tilds, and I think Bob, I don't know if were you at MSSP Alert and got to hear Eric do a little bit of this session?
Yeah, it was a great session. Yeah, really great.
So this is called Cover Your Breaches. I just put the URL. It's tomorrow at 1 p.m. Eastern. I'm pretty sure 1 p.m., not 2 p.m., but I'm almost certain it's 1 p.m. Just check out the link. You'll see it. And it's going to be Eric Tilds and Reed from Fifth Wall. And this is the case, if you guys remember back, the MSP in California who had a legal firm that got ransomware, right, Bob?
Yeah.
And then, basically based on, what was in MSA, what was said, how it went all about, found themselves being sued for about $1 million. And Eric's going to unpack kind of what went wrong and kind of how to insulate. I shouldn't say insulate, but be better prepared, right? Because we all know we live in an era of inevitability where we're going to be dealing with incidences in one way, shape, or form. Hopefully, hopefully benign relative to something like this. All right, so that's on the announcement side. So setting the stage. So we've been talking for the past few weeks. We've had, we're kind of retro, right? Back to DR, right? Who, obviously DR is important. We know it is, but, never really thinking these days so much about, the physical threats, right, Bob, that we've had, these natural disasters, although with me in Florida and you in Louisiana, you can relate. And they've certainly, as they say here in Florida, we are done. We want to unsubscribe for the Hurricane of the Month Club, right, Bob?
Yeah, right.
But we did some really good stuff on the positive side. We were able to raise a fair amount of money for Kemper and his staff, and that's being put to good use. So again, thank you for all that. So this week we're kind of back at it on the digital side of things. And, as I was saying to Chris and Bob offline, most vulnerabilities, if you talk to folks like Steve Carter, who's the CEO of Nucleus Security, who ran a big portion of the DoD's vulnerability management before starting his own organization. Ed, by the way, Ed, yes, it will be recorded. Most vulnerabilities these days, Bob, you have to be aware, but it's not like, FUD, hey, the sky's falling, etc.
Yeah.
But occasionally you get one that the threat actors really glom onto. And this Veeam vulnerability, which has been out now for several weeks, is really gaining some momentum by threat actors, ransomware gangs, etc. And so I really wanted to get Chris on here because this is something, it's one thing when it's, a platform that isn't used a lot by MSPs. And I don't want to say we don't care, but this one's in a lot of people's stacks. Fair, Bob?
Yeah, it's like SolarWinds, right? Reminds me of the SolarWinds thing. You had a lot of people using it. Absolutely.
Yeah. So you have CISO ringing the bell out with articles. You have many of the main publications talking about the ransomware groups. And then in speaking with Chris, he's personally, they're personally dealing with it. When I say personally, their firm, right, is actively working cases of this. So I thought, again, let's dig into what might be going on here, the why behind it. Chris, I think everybody knows you, but quick intro for if maybe one or two people on here that may not know you, quick intro.
Yeah, the two people have been in the cave. Yeah, it's Chris. I'm with Solace. We're based in Austin. We're an incident response and managed security firm. We used to be an MSP when we were acquired a few years back by a London-based insurance carrier called CFC. That MSP got rolled off and is now part of Integris. So lived in the MSP space and the security space for a while. Now just live in the MSSP and incident response space, but we do a lot of work with MSPs like Bob, who happens to be on here today. So, yep, happy to be here and talk about this.
Awesome. And Bob, thanks for sitting in because Gary he's been in, meetings. He's got Troop here this week, then DataCon the following week. Phyllis has had travel all month. So we'll have the crew back together in November, just in time, I think, for IT Nation. So then everybody will be out again. But I appreciate you coming in, co-hosting. So for those that may not know you, Bob, thanks. Tell us a little about yourself.
Yeah, so my name is Bob Miller. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of Global Data Systems. We are an MSSP in Lafayette, Louisiana. And as Chris said, we're also partners with quite a few companies, but we're partners with Solus from a MDR standpoint. So that's the connection between Chris and I. We know a lot of the same people. I'll put it that way.
Yeah. All right. And according to Ed, your photo or Chris's photo is in every post office. And I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. All right, Chris. So let's just level set about this vulnerability. CVE 2024 40771. A 9.8. Talk to us a little about. Get everybody on the fairway. It's easy to Google, but what is it about this Veeam vulnerability that makes it so critical in terms of its rating?
Yeah, so it basically allows any Veeam system that has that vulnerability. It allows anybody, and it doesn't appear that they need to have a great bit of knowledge to start launching commands at will with admin rights. So I mean, it's the worst of the worst. I mean, the vulnerability is there, the exploit information's out there. So once somebody finds this, it's easy for them to take advantage of and do what they want. And it just to say is what we are seeing is that they're using it to delete backups.
Yeah.
So that's one of the hard, over the years we've done a better job. We collectively as MSPs and IT people have done better jobs of securing backups. But this is the one little piece that, people thought that they had immutable backups, but threat actor gets in, they're gone forever.
Yeah, absolutely. Any thoughts of, are they using it for extortion too, Chris, do you think there as well?
Yeah. So what we're seeing is it's the ransomware groups that are taking advantage of this. So obviously the first thing they want to do is delete backups. So they're deleting backups and then encrypting data and exfiltrating data, all those same things. And so, when they delete those backups and they encrypt your data, you're screwed. Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah, you are.
Yeah. So let's talk a little about. We were hoping to get Sophos had they were quoted quite a bit. They've got a really good IR team. We were hoping to get Linda Smith on, who, Chris, you did a panel 2 years ago at Write a Boom with. She's awesome, but she had a class she couldn't attend. But they were quoted because they're seeing quite a few cases. So talk to us a little bit about initial access here, Chris. We're seeing VPN as, surprisingly, as one of the main ways in which the threat actors are any thoughts on, is it just easy pickings? And can you unpack that a little bit about why you think Sophos is seeing that as the kind of the initial access point?
Yeah, well, I think number one, it is easy pickings. I mean, they're finding either firewall vulnerabilities or VPN credentials that makes it easy for them to get in. And the ones that we're seeing is the firewalls weren't updated, and the issue that they have, the vulnerability they have, allows you to bypass MFA. So even in the case where they had VPN with MFA, the threat actors have figured out that they can use this vulnerability to bypass it. So thus they're into the network. And then once they're in the network, and this is what we've always talked about patching, is you got to be patched. It's usually not the patches that allow the initial access, but it's the lack of patches that allow the threat actor to kind of do whatever they want once they're in the network. And this is a perfect example of the situation where they found a, easy firewalls to get around, and they just weren't updated like they should have been. This wasn't a case where it's a 0 day and there wasn't any type of mitigation that you could have taken. And they've gone in there, and then they found this vulnerability, and they said, well, I don't need to crack or do anything with the Veeam password. I'm just going to use that vulnerability to get into the system and delete backups. And then they can just go off their day, and they can do the rest of the stuff that they normally do in the rest of the environment to gain access and do the exfiltration and the encryption at that point.
Chris, we talked a lot over the years about access brokers. The ransomware gangs have been able to move very rapidly on this. So I'm curious, how much is the ecosystem, the threat actor ecosystem at play here, where, we hear about a vulnerability like this? Is it, do you, your hypothesis that, hey, let's go to the access brokers, who's got VPN creds to, get into said amount, companies that we feel have Veeam, what's your thoughts on how this is working, maybe from an ecosystem, if you had to guess?
Yeah, I think in what we're seeing in these situations is that I think either a ransomware group or an access broker discovered maybe that there was a consistent way of getting into a number of clients, several clients that belong to one MSP. So we have seen cases, especially in the last 12 months, where how that initial access broker gained that information, we don't know, but they've gained information around an MSP and their clients. For example, we've seen it where there's the same admin username and admin passwords used across the MSP client. So an access broker has figured that out and then turned around and probably sold that access or whatever. And what we're seeing in this particular situation, and that the cases we've seen seem to have a common point and a common thing. So if I was to hypothesize about it, I would say this is probably a situation where the MSP was really good about standardization across their client base. So their clients all probably run the same sonic wall or similar sonic wall, and they all happen to not be updated. So that was how they figured out how to gain initial access across the board into these multiple clients. And then they were able to take advantage of the Veeam exploit because probably, again, hypothesizing, the MSP is standardized on Veeam and they hadn't patched or updated, mitigated across their client base. And so that's probably, again, this is complete speculation at this point, but this is what I think happened in this case. So it was one of these situations where I don't think this is back in the day where we saw people specifically targeting MSPs to take advantage of this. I think somebody found this information with one MSP and found out that it had a one-to-many effect. And then somebody has since taken advantage of that. It was just, again, easy pickings because they could use the same recipe on each of these clients associated with this MSP.
Yeah, interesting, Chris. So in terms of, I mentioned this earlier a little bit, but in terms of really attracting ransomware actors is ransomware gangs, is the fact that, we're talking about backups and that we can do double and triple extortion, anytime we're talking about data, is that a big reason, do you feel, or a reason why the ransomware gangs are spun up pretty heavily around this one?
Yeah, I mean, in the if you can exfiltrate data, I mean that's their strongest leverage they have, right? But then again, if they can make it to where they have to pay them to decrypt the data, that's even better, right? I mean, the thing about it is there's really nothing dissuading these ransomware operators from doing their work. I mean, we're seeing even more so today where people are like, "Hey, look, I'm not going to pay these criminals. I mean, they got my data, I get it, but these ransomware operators are they're going to different lengths to really just put the pressure on these victims. I mean, they're creating websites instead of just putting stuff on dark websites. We're seeing them creating public facing websites now that have that data on there. They're reaching out to their clients. You know, if it's healthcare, they're reaching out to the patients. I mean, they're not. It used to be we could see them maybe try this for maybe 2 to 4 weeks and give up, but they're not giving up, and they're just going and going and going and doing everything they can to force somebody to pay. And a lot of times people are like, is this guy ever going to quit bothering harassing me? I'm going to entertain paying him just so he stops harassing me. And the threat actors have figured this out. I mean, there's no risk to these guys getting caught or anything. So they just stay after it. It's it's the worst I've seen in a long time, especially with the harassment side of things. So if they can get in, destroy backups, take data, and have you basically, in their in their fist, squeezing as hard as they can, it puts people in a really difficult situation, that really probably had no motivation to pay whatsoever, and they're kind of getting in a stuck in a corner. It's tough.
Of course, I've been fortunate to be, in your proximity when you've negotiated, obviously not knowing clients and this and that, but it's an art which you have a very amazing skill set to do in negotiating with threat actors. I'm just curious, has it changed? Are they, because you've established yourself over the years, they interact with you because you're of your word that you'll get things done, and there's certain code, but is it getting more ruthless, like just based on what you're saying there? And
Definitely more ruthless, definitely less organized, meaning like before, a couple of years ago, before the bigger groups were either being quote shut down or whatever, there was a little bit more uniformity in how things went and what things were said, and you kind of knew like kind of lower and upper limits and all that type of stuff. But the negotiation. This is why we always say don't try to negotiate yourselves, because you have to build a rapport with these people at the individual level, and you got to feel them out, and you can't just use like a script to do it. And we've seen people try that, or we see people try to you know be rude or demeaning or whatever to these threat actors, and that doesn't help the situation at all. Or we've seen people who are like they don't talk to them at all and they completely ignore them, and that's a bad news. But yeah, it is definitely getting tougher because there's not these threat actors when they're negotiating with you. In my opinion, they don't have as many eyes watching what they're doing as we did in the past. Like, these ransomware groups of the past, they would have people seemingly monitor these conversations. And you could see it too. You could see where maybe the conversation's not going the right way. And you could tell someone else has come in because the tone has changed, the vernacular has changed, those types of things have changed, but not so much anymore. And it's just, it is weird. And with like, take Lockbit as an example. So Lockbit, if Lockbit hits you and you're negotiating through their web portal, you're probably negotiating with what is Lockbit. Then you have other people that have attacked you and they're negotiating through email. That's just people using Lockbit's tools and methods and and malware, whatever you want to call it. That's that. So even though they both look, smell, and feel like Lockbit, from a negotiations perspective, they're different. So they're not. So yeah, it's. And I think any ransom negotiator on here would say it's gotten more complicated and more challenging because again, you're dealing more at an individual level than at a group level.
I got a theory about that. Honestly, is I think what's happened is that what we're seeing is that malware and or extortion software as a service, that market is maturing, and it's going down market, so that less and less experienced people can use the system, right? And like Chris was talking about in the very beginning, they were very careful about monitoring those communications because the value of their framework, their malware framework, was based on people actually doing what they said they were going to do, right, in the early days. And we're quickly getting beyond that. Now, this has gone more down market. People are just paying so much per month to have access to the tools. They're not as refined or as educated as the other people that used to do it. So to me, this is just a clear indication that market's maturing. Those frameworks and the people that are using them have changed, just like we would expect them to over time, right? Less professionals doing it, more amateurs getting into the ball game, which is why we're going to see a whole bunch of variation on a go forward basis. So that's my take on it.
Yeah, Bob, you bring up an excellent point, because when you think about the phishing kits out there today and how we're seeing the continuation of adversary in the middle attacks with M365. It's relatively talk about low barrier to entry. I mean, and kitted up and reasonably priced. I mean, so yeah.
We also see sloppiness on the encryption side too. So we've run into more issues decrypting data when people need to decrypt, because a couple of years ago you run into issues. There was a escalation path. And those ransomware operators they wanted to help you. They wanted to be successful. They didn't want the reputation of having bad encryption. I mean, Lockbit was a great example. They used to brag about how fast they decrypted and how quality it was and everything. But we're starting to see where just the actual encryption process itself and the encryptor, it just corrupts files to where they're not decryptable. And so, it's gotten a lot uglier.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love all the comments, right? Eric and Steven were talking about the lower the barrier of entry, but commoditized crime. That's exactly what we're seeing. Just like Eric said, we're getting to the point where that framework's commoditized. So I agree with him 100%.
Yeah, no doubt. So Chris, you've shared a bit about, what your team is seeing with this vulnerability. Is this going to be one of these, ones where, pick a hard internet facing hardware vendor where, we've seen a lot of that where, via things like Shodan, right? It's, the gift that keeps giving. What do you make of something like this? Is this going to be one that we're going to see for the foreseeable future? Or is this one that's, we're seeing just the peak of it right now?
I do think we'll see it linger, and I don't know why. I mean, it's, again, I've been thinking about this one a lot. Like you say, hey, look, I'm an IT person, or I'm an MSP, and I'm looking at where goes back to this kind of data flows. Where is data flow, right? It's going to the backup system, right? How do I get to that backup system? I mean, what's the attack surface? What's the, I mean, to me, again, there's two sides of the story, but on this one, I can't see. It's like, how can you not, as an MSP, when you see a 9.8 and it's Veeam, how do you just not jump all over that and say, hey guys, tonight we're going to be patching the living hell out of Veeam? Yeah. And then same thing with firewalls, right? I mean, I've been talking about this for a while too. It's like, and we talk to our clients, I'm like, hey, look, there's going to be situations where there may be a vulnerability that something has to happen in the middle of the day, and we have to disrupt business to update this or to do whatever. I mean, that's just the reality of things. And so when you see something like this with both two critical vulnerabilities, one at a firewall level and one at a software level, of two critical platforms, I mean, it just it boggles the mind. But that's what makes me lead to believe if this can happen at this point, then this is going to be those things to linger. I mean, hey, remember the proxy shell? We just had another one of those. Somebody spun up an Exchange server and didn't patch it. They just spun up a brand new Exchange server, didn't patch it. And when the guys got in there, like, this can't be right. This can't be this thing happening again. It's 2 years ago. Yep, there it is again. So yeah, it's crazy, but I do see we're going to see these things linger for a while, because I just think people with backup systems, I think at one point, to their defense, they're sometimes afraid to touch them because they want to screw them up. But at the same time, they're also, maybe they don't view them as production, and maybe that's why they put them on the back burner. I don't know. I mean, it's just crazy.
So Bob, let me ask you a question as we turn over the questions to you.
Yeah.
Chris mentioned something, and I gotta wonder: is it something Gary Pica talks a lot about with roles and process? Is that where things get like Chris is sitting there going, "How is it that a 9.8 slips through the cracks?"
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, it's insane, right? I mean, because now, we're an MSP, but we picked up on that vulnerability as soon as it was advertised, right? By the way, we use Veeam, just so you know. So we saw it immediately it came out because we run a vulnerability management program, right? And as soon as that CV was published, all of our dashboards lit up like a Christmas tree saying, "Hey, this is a critical change that's got to happen inside." But we're the same way with our firewalls, like Chris was talking about. We don't play games with firewalls either. I don't care if it's a critical update, we do them then. We don't wait to think about it too much or anything else. We do those updates right away. And you know what? We've done a risk assessment for ourselves, and we know which ones are our critical systems, and so we treat them that way. So when we see VEs that are related to those critical systems, we act like we should act on those. And we also have a very mature Active Directory and roles and responsibilities matrix, so people can't get access to things they're not supposed to. So I mean, it's a layered thing. Will it linger? Yeah, because people are just not very disciplined about the layers in their security strategy. I mean, we talk about phishing being the damn problem. I mean, that's still a problem after all these years, right?
That's my point.
Yeah.
Does it come down to roles and again, maturity,
Yeah.
roles, process? Is that
Right.
where things are falling down here? When you see, like Strand will always talk about, give me an incident, and I guarantee it's going to be more than not basics. It's going to be fundamentals. It's not going to be some crazy thing that couldn't have been prevented, as we know from this.
Yeah, I mean, it's an operational maturity level thing, right? I mean, at some point, you have to change your focus to being very rigid on those things, and that's when you start really improving from an operational maturity level. Yes, you give up a little bit of flexibility, but in response to that, you get a lot more security. You mitigate a lot more risk, right? That's my take on this, is that you just have to be very disciplined about how you operate an MSP, and it requires a certain level of attention, and that means internally and externally. But that leads right into this next question, by the way. So I'll ask Chris this question because it leads right into this. So because I know the answer to this, but I would love to get Chris's take on it. So Chris, from an MSP standpoint, I know you work with you don't do a lot with them directly, but you understand that ecosystem. How important is it for them to understand their customers' third-party vendor relationships as it relates to them, right? Because we know what we are as an MSP, we know what our vendors are, but how important is it for us to know what our customers' third-party software ecosystem is what it has in it?
Yeah, no, it's incredibly important to know what it has in it. We see a lot of situations where we're in a recovery efforts, and the MSP knows quite a bit. Other third parties that are there for, that could be a piece of software they support or a piece of hardware they support, and you can see right there. There's just like, hey, we don't have anything to do with that, and then the client's like, they don't know either, and so we're trying to figure all that mess out on whose responsibility is what. And in an incident situation, we want to try to limit the amount of people that are involved in that situation for legal reasons and confidentiality
Yeah, that's right.
reasons. And so we're not asking the MSPs to substitute for those people, but we need at least to know, like, hey, you should at least know points of contact, what software is being used. you know is that third party one of these third parties that's going to be cooperative or not cooperative. A lot of times we find out during the incident that the customer hasn't been renewing the maintenance and support with the third party. So when something does happen, then there's nothing we can do, like that,
Right.
or the software is so deprecated, and the MSP learns of that during the incident as well, as opposed to knowing that ahead of time. So it's incredibly important.
Well, Chris, we saw this with Screen Connect. I mean, literally
Right.
out of your last statement, we knew people were running deprecated versions and not paying maintenance. And, kudos to Patrick Beggs for, saying we don't care. And if you paid or not, we're going to give you the update all to that was a great move on their part. But, this is this is an area where, if you had Ryan Weeks on today, another area of process, Bob, is about, who are the third party, really having detailed inventory. And sorry for, let me just digress here. As Brian Blakely said, looking at your customers' contracts and like who their top who they're doing business with, because you might find out, oh wow, this is how your top customers, and this is what they're expecting, they're using these systems, and or you're using this line of business app we're not supporting, and these are the critical remote control tools they're using, or these are other remote, like those things are so critical.
Right.
But it comes back to, as you said, Bob, a minute ago, is maturity, right? To be able to do that.
Yeah, I can tell you from a practical example standpoint, when SolarWinds was happening, right, a few years back, we knew which of our customers were also using SolarWinds. So the first thing we did was start notifying them about the weakness, even before it was really announced publicly. We were letting them know about the back channel information we were getting related to SolarWinds, because we knew they used it. We work with mid-market enterprise customers, so there's a lot of co-management that goes on for those bigger enterprise customers, and so they run their own software stacks, right? And so anybody that we are very familiar with our customers' software stack on critical systems, whether they're using the same thing as us or not is not really relevant. But if they are, then when we see things that are vulnerabilities and we see them before they're actually public, we call them and say, hey, by the way, we're getting a lot of scuttlebutt here. We need you to be paying attention. You might want to start thinking about taking some pro action, even though we're not managing that for you. We know it's in your environment, right? And it can cause some real damage. So that follows on with Screen Connect. That follows on with any number of RMM tools, that are out there. We know which RMM tools people use, because when you get right down to it, there's about half a dozen pieces of software that really have the run of the room in an MSP and or an enterprise, and knowing which categories those are and which software is in them is really critical, because you take on a lot of risk when you take on a customer. You're taking on their ecosystem. It's like a girlfriend, right? You're taking on everybody that everybody's known on both sides of the partnership when you do these kinds of things. So being very familiar with what they have in their ecosystems hypercritical for an MSP to even protect themselves, right? Because you are uptight and friendly with them in a lot of different ways from a technology standpoint. So that's just part of, like you said, goes back to operational maturity levels. I got a whole nother rant about unsigned DLLs. I'd love to talk to Chris about one of these days about the same sort of thing, about the lack of discipline about these, about these systems, right? But
I'd just like to take this to a whole, we could have the X-rated version of the cyber call out there with a.
I could, yeah, I'm all ready for it. I can tell you.
He went to the girlfriends, man, and I had to.
Yeah. I pulled that back. That was about to go too far, so I pulled back.
You opened the doors wide open for Chris.
No, I got it out of there. I shut up. I shut up about that. I had good sense.
No, but
Chris, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say on this. We still, we have cases we have today where companies have multiple offices, and and they've chosen to use an MSP that's local to each office, but they're on the same network. And so that thing makes things really interesting too, because you don't have complete visibility, and then a lot of times you have pointing fingers, and now you need the cooperation of multiple MSPs when you're dealing with an event/incident. So yeah, I mean this I think this third party risk to your client is probably more of a risk to you as the MSP when it all comes down to it. If you're playing the ignorance card, or whatever, or if for some reason the client's not sharing the information with you, you really need to press forward and get that information.
Quick question, if I may, Chris. What about our vendors here? Could a vendor one of our big vendors running Veeam, and they happen to get owned? Like, what could the implications there be? Because we're going to have, incident notification. Like, walk us through that. Is that something we need to really think about here?
Yeah, I mean, if you had you could take the example from Blackbaud from a few years ago, right, where they got hit. They sent notifications out, said, "Hey, no, everything's fine. That data was encrypted," meaning they encrypted the data. Blackbaud did. It's been safe, and then they had to come back and release a new notification saying, "Oh, wait a second. We had all the backups, and the backups weren't encrypted. So therefore, your data was not as safe as we initially told you," right? So yeah, I mean, if a vendor gets popped on this type of situation, because look, I mean, they deleted backups, but that's not what to say somebody couldn't take the time to exfiltrate the backup data and potentially, depending on how it was configured, I can't go down that road because I'm not a Veeam expert. But I mean, there's a possibility they could have just taken the backup data itself. One of the examples I like to fall back on was one of the earliest cases I remember having was an MSP who did backup as a service. So they had clients that they only did backups for. The threat actor got into their environment and deleted the backups because they were backups. That was the only copy of that backup data for their clients. So in essence, it was production data. If you think about it, right? That was production data, the data of the business being backups. So, 2020 hindsight, but they should have been backing up the backup data. So they should have had an immutable copy of their client's data in case that happened. And so it gets pretty ugly. So if a backup vendor was to get or somebody that uses Veeam, because there's cloud providers that do Veeam and everything like that. Yeah, it gets pretty nasty in this third party stuff on who's going to do what, when, and to what degree.
Last comment I'll make, Bob, and back to you. I mean, sounds a lot like Snowflake to me, Chris.
Shut up. No, those Snowflake guys. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah, that's a little. Yeah, that's a one in itself right there. That's a difficult one because they were really. I don't know. That situation could be handled a lot differently too in hindsight, but it's like the screen. It's like the Change Healthcare thing and ConnectWise taking the hit on that when it was even
that was pretty shitty.
even when the Change Healthcare guy came out and said, "Hey, it wasn't Screen." Well, I'm going to tell you, it wasn't Screen Connect, and so those, I mean, so so I think from a vendor's perspective, uh, being as transparent as they can, and if you are using a third party for backups, I mean, this is where I tell MSPs, your client should be asking you these questions, like, what are you doing to make sure that this stuff is secure?
Yeah, because I mean, if you look at the exploit, this thing, I mean, you were asking about vendors if they're running Veeam, what could happen? Well, I mean, if we want to be theoretical about it, this particular exploit allows them to escalate a user that automatically gets created as part of this exploit, and it's the user is point and it's got administrative capabilities. Well, if you're not the ransomware type, let's go back and look at what they did with SolarWinds. They went and got in the development chain. They were a lot sneakier, right? So they went and duplicated a certificate server so that they could run amok and move laterally inside that network. And then they got in the development chain so that they could mule in their malware as part of the golden image of these updates going through. So I mean, once you're in with elevated credentials, all bets are off. You can do anything and everything that's ever been done on any network, regardless of whether you're a vendor or an enterprise or an MSP or anything else. Once you get an authorized account inside of the wire, all bets are off, right? I mean, unless you've got a layered defense, you're going to get your ass handed to you. That's
Yeah.
what's really
And we only know what we know, right? I mean,
yeah,
we know that companies of all sizes use Veeam. I mean, it's not just
yeah,
specific to the SMB space. So I
right,
guarantee that, Bob, just what you brought out. I mean, we're talking about these ransomware guys taking advantage of it, but you damn well know nation state guys have been in there and there's,
100%.
yeah, no telling what they've been doing.
They probably pack muled in all kinds of toolkits and laid them around, right, for when they really want to get in there and mess things up. So yeah, that's huge. Well, and it again goes back to our. I like how these things just flow into the next question, but one of the Rapid Civic guys are basically saying that 20% or more of their cases in 2024 related to this Veeam exploit, and I'm kind of like I'm kind of like Andrew on this. That seems like a hell of a big number,
It does seem
a
like
hell of a big number for that. I mean, what's your perception of that? I mean, that seems high to me.
And this is published, Bob.
Yeah,
This
it's published.
is
Yeah,
out there.
yeah, and it's 20% of their cases, so I don't know what
yeah,
that means, right? Yeah, so it's
it's true.
possible, right? I mean, they're
Could be.
they're kind of a big shop and handle they have the tendency to handle bigger cases, so it's very possible that is it, right?
Yeah,
Because they're like the majority of their cases run Veeam,
yeah,
and so maybe that's just it makes it super easy to delete. I mean, coming from the banking world and coming from our change management process, and I mean, our backup systems were incredibly crucial. But it took a lot to update them. I mean, it was pretty involved back then, but it was a different deal. We're in a mixed environment, AIX, Windows. We had multiple. I mean, there's a lot to it. So, but I can't give that excuse for this vulnerability because it just seems like this vulnerability, and it sounds like Bob, you went through the steps. It doesn't seem
Yeah.
like it was that difficult to.
No. It's not. In fact, it's kind of a normal day at the shop. I mean, honestly, you get firewall updates all the time that are hypercritical, right? That have a real exploitable situation. You got to deal with that now. So I mean, it's just a maturity thing. Again, go ahead,
But
Andy.
I was going to say, Bob, my sense is you have policy creation with your
That's correct.
customers, and in that policy, there's some language that says, "Hey, based
100%.
on this level of vulnerability, we will disrupt your business." And
Yeah, we let them know up front, right? We definitely do, especially on firewalls, because firewalls are kind of a special critter, as well as VPN concentrators. Those are both, we can routers, switches, those things we can take a little bit more of a longer view on, but not VPN concentrators and not firewalls. Those are critical gateways into any network, so you have to jump on those quickly. Yeah,
But my point is there's policy in place that
that's correct.
that they can't say, well, we shouldn't do this, or no,
Yeah,
we agreed,
yeah,
right? We agreed, and this
that's
is
correct.
So anyway,
Yeah, our patching policy is actually part of it. Comes when you get our when we establish a relationship with you, and we do a scope of work on managed services. Our patching policy is actually included in that scope of work about what we do and don't do, right? Because we have a couple rules about we don't stay on the absolute current release of router software, because typically new versions of router software have more exploits than two back. We use the two back rule. We stay two back of the current version, and that's where we are by default, and we'll keep you at that rate. Now in some cases we'll keep you a little bit further back if there's been no actual patches of substance. So we could talk all day about Chris. I bet we could talk all day about patching strategy, right, and how to really accomplish that.
Yeah.
To maintain an operational maturity level, because there's
Yeah.
there's some subtleties there.
There is some we can kind of test on, right, as MSPs. It just isn't practical. But I would say what I still hear this today is a lot of MSPs, when it comes to patching that's automated, they'll do that all day. But when it comes down to stuff that they have to
There you
manually
go.
do, they just find excuses to put it off.
Yeah. Well, we honestly we wound up having to build our own system, to things like Ansible and other techniques we got. We actually built some DevOps software to help us with those automate the updates of the ones that are not automated on their own by the vendor, for the very reason you're talking about. Keeping up with it takes work, right? And you're either going to throw people at it, or you're going to throw technology at it. So it's one of the two, but it doesn't matter. You have to do it. There's not really any room to get around that anymore. So, this comes back to the age old question: how in the hell are we going to get developers of these developers and operators and researchers to all work better together about releasing the information as it relates to these exploits, right? I mean, I think some of this is, I still don't feel like there is an organized, structured way to do it. I know that we see CVEs, but I think there's a lot of work that goes on before it even makes it to the CVE level that really we don't have good visibility in. What do you think about that, Chris?
No, I agree. I mean, I don't. I mean, it I mean, they're just not. I still don't see like people thinking about this from an impact perspective, right? So it's a
Right.
CVE, blah blah blah, and I don't know on this particular one when people are like, "Well, that's behind my firewall. It's not publicly facing. I don't need to worry about it." There's so many. It'd be interesting to maybe put these guys in the room. Their voices change, and we darken their face and go, "What the hell were you thinking?" Be honest with us, right? So we
Right.
can all
Yeah.
talk about
Exactly.
this.
Yeah.
But you're right. I mean, on these things, I mean, there is not a system or process or anything that I guess lights a fire. That's what we're trying to get at. I just,
there's no Aaron talks about this in his years about security too, though, Bob. He talks about, in IT, there's standards. In security, there's no standards. So your VDP for this company vulnerability disclosure program for this
Right.
manufacturer can be drastically different from another. The threat researcher, the white hats, that bug bounties and things of that nature. It's to your point, where we could spend all day on a topic. This is one where we could spend hours
Yes.
debating what's the right way, the wrong way. but there's this sense of, do we, hey, we want the glory that we found this and publicize that, we were able to replicate the exploitation and the research and notoriety, versus allowing, the manufacturer to, the necessary time before disclosure, and should they notify everybody. And, it's certainly not an easy subject, for sure.
No, when I first joined up with Global Data Systems, I spent a lot of time looking for, because I really expected to see that there would be a lot of work out there around, okay, what's the right sort of discipline related to patching and frequency, and why do you choose doing it this way versus other ways? And the thing I found out right away was there was none of that. Nobody wanted to take responsibility for putting any language in the universe that said, hey, this is the best practices, right? Because that's how scared everybody is of the process. And some of it's what Chris is talking about. Not everybody does it judiciously, right? And the only way, if you put your name on something and say this is how we do it, and then you don't do that, then you take on risk, right? So I started understanding why there was not a lot of it out there. But I think we got to get ourselves past that point. I really do. I think we got to be able to call out, just like Chris is saying, we got to be able to look each other in the eye and say, here's where my head was. And then we go, well, that's not smart. Let's look at it. Let's look at it from these other angles and figure out a better solution. And by the way, there's a lot of this that rubs on my wrong bone specifically about, we're talking about software and how these vulnerabilities show up all the time, but we're also in a lot of our webinars and a lot of sessions like this, we talk about regulatory bodies trying to force the MSPs to be responsible. And what they're saying is you need to be responsible for the global environment of non-discipline as it relates to the damn software development processes that half these people are using, right? And that's the part that really burns my ass, is that, okay, you're telling me as the MSP in the middle that I got to be concerned about what third-party software I use, when we all know that the discipline at the software development level is just not being followed to the best practices standpoint. And there are a million examples of that, right? So
we do have an executive order now, Bob, that's going to fix that.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I get it. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. It's like the FCC saying your IP phones need to tell you where they are all the time. Well, they're in buildings and they can't see satellites. So you can make that rule all you want, but the universe is telling you no, it doesn't work that way, right? So we run into that all the time.
It's interesting that in what degree. I mean, I saw an article I think last week was that there's still 86,000 FortiGate that are vulnerable that haven't been updated from months ago. I mean, it's just crazy. So I mean, to what and I'm not a fan, like during that I brought a proxy logon and proxy shell. I mean, there were reports that the FBI was updating systems for people whether they wanted it or not, right? I'm not a fan of that either. So I don't want the government in my stuff. But what are you going to do? I mean, it's a tough one in this Veeam situation. I mean, again, kind of hypothetically though, if I'm a customer and I get popped and I know that this was something my we talk about a lot of things aren't the MSP's fault, but you have a firewall and a system that's not patched, not updated, and the MSP knew well damn about it.
They got to own that. That's absolutely right. They have to own that part. Not the flaw in Veeam, but the fact that they didn't respond, they got to own. Absolutely.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Well, now that we're gonna go from the aggravating to the entertaining, because I read this article, but I love Andrew and what he throws out here, but this was perfect because it's a good way to end it up, because this is going to be interesting. It's operational maturity to personnel maturity, right? So, the article came out a few months ago where a company, I'm not going to name a name, turns out had in a company who should know better.
They should know better. I mean,
they should know better, right? But they came out and they had actually hired an employee from North Korea, right? There was an employee, and I can't remember if they wound up, it was a contractor or employee proper. But anyway, inside of the wire individual working with
employee proper, if I recall.
Yeah, that's what I thought too. So
yeah, I mean, they should have known better, and I'm surprised this didn't happen to them before.
Yeah.
Well played, Chris. Well played.
If only they'd known about it before. Yeah, I get you. So I don't even know where to go with that particular one. So I mean, this is the first one that I've seen where they'd been there quite a while too, right? So they had the opportunity to actually do things like exfiltrate data and, download whatever information they wanted to because they were inside the wire, right? Go ahead,
Well,
Andrew.
I'll maybe just set the stage for everybody. There's an
Yeah.
article out there now about, I'll put it out there. Ironically, it's a Secure Works who just announced being acquired by Sophos, but I'll
Right.
put it out there.
Yeah, I just put it out there for you.
Okay,
I
thanks,
helped
Chris.
out there. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. But go ahead, Bob. This.
No, yeah, that's. I mean, in reality, it's like, well, because I thought back to my years of when I was having to hire a bunch of people and the amount of background checks that we did. They had to be state and federal cleared, and in some cases, we work with we work with law enforcement agencies, so we have to actually get like federal clearances on people to kind of do some work. But I thought this was interesting that this particular group, whatever their policies are, right, obviously didn't cover the right level of background checks. Chris, have you ever heard of any other applications where that's been the case? Where it turns well, I noticed that there have been some. I have seen some articles about Chinese nationals being hired into organizations. Right, there seems to have been a lot of that recently as well. This one hits kind of close to home because of the company that he was a part of and what that actual company does for our ecosystem. But
Yeah.
have you heard of other transgressions like that?
No, I mean, yeah, it's an interesting, right? I think this is a byproduct of as you get bigger. I think A, you get bigger, and B, you're looking for cheaper talent, right? And so, I mean, this comes up in discussions all the time. Hey, hire people from here, from here, from here. They do great work. You can get them at a low cost. And if you look at in this particular link, it's dev work, right? It's the risk.
Yeah,
There's some lists in there and full stack developer. And a lot of people don't look for communication skills as necessary as a necessity for that job. So you could have somebody that has poor English or whatever, and you're like, well, I don't care as long as they can code. I'm happy, and that's one of the biggest red flags, right? I mean, so it's yeah, this I think this is just this is really it's very similar to business email compromise when I read this, right? It's like, hey, I'm hiring you, whatever. Oh, hey, can you go ahead and send that laptop here instead?
right.
Check, no problem, right? And it's the same kind of concept, right? Instead of getting fished for banking details, you got fished on from sending a laptop.
Yeah,
It's then you got to wonder, like, what do you need to do to vet that better? I mean, there's background checks and all other stuff. It would be interesting to know more details on how this person was able to get that far in.
yeah,
Was it just a human error? Did they miss some steps? Have they added some steps? I mean, it's just, or did they, because they're a foreign national, they couldn't do a background check? Because that happens a lot too, right? There's no way to do a background check on somebody as easily overseas as there is here because the data is not available. So, yeah, there's more details to be known on this one, but I can definitely see this being like the extortion tactic on this is fantastic. I mean,
yeah.
you're in there and you're grabbing everything, and you're a developer. You could be grabbing
Oh, you're gonna get the code base. Yeah, yeah,
intellectual property out the wazoo. Yeah.
yeah. You
Which
can
is
grab the whole
they
code
did.
base.
They exfilled quite a bit of stuff
Yeah.
in this particular case, right, Bob?
Well, that's what caught him. It was the volume of file transfers. I mean, that it wasn't somebody was asking about how you liked the new 401k you just got, and it wasn't anything like that. It was the fact that he was downloading gigabytes of data or trying to onto his onto his laptop, and that's it was really as it usually is. It's the ones who are not the smartest ones that get caught, right? I mean, because if he'd have been more judicious, he could have peeled that stuff off in smaller chunks and he probably could have been there to exercise his 401k before they figured out who he was, right?
Well, it's just like the phone companies and that, the Chinese access into those carriers. I mean, like, how does that stuff happen? I mean, some of those guys have, if you look at their security teams' resumes, those guys are highly credentialed, and it just seems like it was too easy for these guys to do what they're doing.
Yeah. That knowing what I know about the communication sector, I will tell you this is that those things have been built up and acquired and all that over time, so none of it talks smoothly together, and the level of integration is low. So it doesn't matter if you got lipstick on a pig, it's still a pig but behind that lipstick, and that's typically what happens in the old telecoms is because they're kind of Frankenstein together, right? So I actually kind of understand why they get themselves into that situation, but they should spend some of that profit going back and, modernizing that and reducing the risk, right? So it's all part of, and again, these are mature companies, but it's all about money at some point,
Yeah,
right?
and
What you need to
just
spend
for
it
the
on.
record for everybody, when Bob's talking about lipstick on a pig, he's not referring to his old girlfriends that he mentioned earlier. So I don't want them to
No,
get
no
upset.
comment.
Bunch of down thumbs on this YouTube from Bob's ex-girlfriends. So
I ain't touching that. I'm done with that. Back to you, Andrew.
All right, Chris. So just one more question about this, Chris, because MSPs are going up scale. There's a lot more co-managed, Chris, upmarket co-managed. When you hear something like this, what steps, or should there be steps when we're interfacing with larger corporations where we might run into something like this, or God forbid we run into something like this? Do we want to understand hiring policy in some of these big companies we're dealing with that we're on the networks of these organizations?
yeah, it's the co-managed stuff is interesting because we have a lot of companies that have us do security, but they have internal IT and we do security and so on and so forth. And yeah, there's a lot of stuff you need to know. I mean, you do kind of need to know how they're staffed, where people are staffed. One of the things we've always done on risk assessments for people is ask about hiring practices. That's really important. One of the first questions always ask is, do you ask questions when you're hiring somebody, no matter at what position? Do you ask questions about cybersecurity of them? Like, how versed are they? Even no matter what, they should know at some point and have some idea of how to secure stuff when they're working for a company. So I think it is important to know, but even there's just so many things that can go sideways, and instantly people are going to point the finger at you as that third party, and you're going to have to defend yourself. And it's yeah. So the more you know, the more you can know, the better you're going to be. And I think your customers are going to respect the fact that you know all that type of stuff. It's a lot to know. I mean, especially if you're co-managing and maybe you don't know about every new hire because internal IT is handling part of that and you're not, or whatever. Yeah, you got to figure that out. Especially if they have developers. Those are the people, those are the positions that scare you the most.
Right. All right. So last question, Chris. We'll do a bonus question. You're now that we're in Q4 2024.
Yep.
Thanks as always for joining. Most interesting case that you've had this year?
Well, that's a good one. I'll just say we have had a couple of cases where, I don't know if I mentioned this in a prior episode, where the MSP owner's phones got cloned.
Mm.
No, you didn't.
And so their phones got cloned and they had SMS as two-factor authentication to some critical platforms.
Uh-oh.
So when their phones got cloned, the threat actor was then able to basically gain access to these systems, change passwords, change MFA, and lock them completely out.
Oh, wow.
And not only did they have their own stuff in these platforms, but customers as well. So, and it's interesting. We can't tell if it could be one situation where a person was a very specifically targeted, like somebody's like, hey, I'm going to go after that guy, versus the other one might have been not as targeted, but they were able to clone phone and just gain and then figure out that it was an MSP. But those are the most interesting ones I can talk about right now.
Got it.
Not too much in detail, but yeah.
Awesome. Well, another awesome session, Chris. Thanks for coming in back-to-back weeks. Bob, as always, thanks for filling in as an awesome co-host. And everybody out there, thanks for joining us on Monday, and wishing you all a safe, happy, healthy, and productive day and week ahead. Look forward to seeing you all next Monday. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.